task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence. Lynching. Key features of lynching. A gruesomely iconic form of racial terror was lynching, violent and public acts of torture, which were largely tolerated by officials at all levels of government. 99 such violence traumatized Black people throughout the country, although it most frequently occurred in the South. Although lynchings were carried out against individual victims, the practice of lynching was ultimately aimed at the entire Black community. 101 Indeed, historians have described the trauma of lynching as a contagion that has a multiplier effect across families, communities, and generations. Too much like Jim Crow laws and racial segregation, lynching was primarily a method of enforcing the political, economic, and cultural exploitation of African Americans. 203 For instance, after Booker T. Washington visited the White House to meet with President Theodore Roosevelt, South Carolina Senator Benjamin Tillman remarked, "Now that Roosevelt has eaten with that nigger Washington, we shall have to kill 1,000 niggers to get them back to their places." 104. Lynching was often carried out as a public spectacle. It did not simply involve hanging. Rather, public lynching often featured the prolonged torture, mutilation, dismemberment, and/or burning of the victim. 5. These events attracted large crowds of white people, often numbering in the thousands, which included elected officials, prominent citizens, and entire families, including children. 106 children were given front-row views of the victim, imprinting upon their minds for the rest of their life the concept that Black people do not deserve human dignity. 107 The white press justified and promoted these carnival-like events, while vendors sold food, and printers produced postcards featuring photographs of the lynching and corpse. 108 Spectators would fight over fingers, ears, toes, sexual organs, and other body parts as souvenirs. 209 The physical objects associated with a lynching were prized mementos for the crowd. 210 Publicity of lynchings not only terrorized African Americans, but also allowed white communities to economically and politically benefit. Terror of being lynched prevented African Americans from achieving political power, and preserved them as a compliant, intimidated workforce. 211 This, in turn, largely maintained the Southern economy as it was during enslavement. 12 And while lynching was overwhelmingly, though not exclusively, a Southern phenomenon, 213 its effects were felt throughout the United States, just as white supremacists intended to victimize and oppress all African Americans. 214 Crowd looking at the burned body of Jesse Washington, 18-year-old African American, lynched in Waco, Texas. 15th, 1916. Courtesy of Library of Congress. 3. Racial terror. To maintain white supremacy, lynchings were based on a broad range of perceived violations of the racial caste system. Black people were lynched after being accused of murder or rape, though almost none were legally convicted of their alleged crimes. 115 Regardless, lynching is never an acceptable form of punishment. Many lynchings were based on weak or contrived evidence. 216 For example, white men perpetuated the myth of the unbridled, brutish, Black rapist, to justify lynching Black men for allegedly sexually white women. 217 The lynchings of Black men accused of rape or sexual assault often involved castration, which underscored how white men felt threatened by Black men and used lynching to attack Black manhood. 218 Lynchings were based on much more minor accusations. According to the Tuskegee Institute, approximately 30% of lynching victims were accused of nonviolent offenses. Some victims were lynched only for minor social transgressions, or for demanding basic rights and fair treatment. Black victims were lynched for referring to a white police officer by name, associating with white women, accidentally bumping into a white woman, passing as white, speaking out about racial equality, testifying on behalf of a Black defendant. refusing to take off an army uniform after returning from World War I. 220. African Americans were also lynched for asserting their labor rights and economic rights. For example, in 1918, a black man in Earle, Arkansas refused to work on a white-owned farm without pay. 21 In response, the white citizens of the city cut him into pieces with butcher knives and hung his remains from a tree. 122 In numerous instances, African Americans were also lynched after disputes over wages or debts. In such disputes, if a white person became violent and a black person reacted in self-defense, the black person was often lynched for murder or assault. 23 By killing African Americans for seeking fair treatment or for trivial social disputes, white Americans continued to assert the total control they had held over black lives during slavery. Responding to specific accusations, lynchings were used to drive black residents from a community. For example, after a 1912 lynching in Forsyth County, Georgia, white vigilantes distributed leaflets demanding that all black people leave the county or suffer deadly consequences. 24 As a result, the black population dropped from 1,100 to 30 in 8 years. 25 And in 1918, in Unicoi County, Tennessee, after lynching a black man, a group of white men rounded up 60 black residents, including children, and forced them to watch the corpse burn. 26 The white people told the black people in the town to leave the county within 24 hours. 127 Also united white Americans of all socioeconomic levels. The public violence of lynchings portrayed the white population as strongly allied against the perceived threat of African Americans. 128 White mobs asserted their racial superiority by publicly torturing and killing black victims. 229 Through the Jim Crow period, white Americans experienced divisions along political, economic, and social lines. 130 Although poor white Americans may have lived in conditions more similar to those of poor African Americans, lynching helped prevent interracial class-based alliances by unifying white Americans around a core purpose and identity. 31. Complicit government officials, including police officers, prosecutors, judges, and elected officials, tacitly approved of or assisted in lynchings. 32 Law enforcement officers released black people who had been incarcerated to mobs, placed black prisoners in areas where lynch mobs were known to gather, joined mobs to find African Americans, and assisted with lynchings. 133 Prosecutors and law enforcement regularly failed to identify and try lynchers for their crimes. 34 Only 1% of all lynchings after 1900 resulted in a conviction. 235 judges contributed to these outcomes by presiding over a process that systematically excluded African Americans from juries, mistreated black witnesses, and held trials in jurisdictions with a racist bias. Americans lynched after 1900. 1% of lynching perpetrators convicted. 50% black. 1%. 104. 3. Racial terror. That systematically excluded African Americans from juries, mistreated black witnesses, and held trials in jurisdictions with a racist bias. 36 Local coroners and coroners' juries refused to indict lynchers and made impossible conclusions, such as ruling a death was a suicide after a black farmer was found riddled with bullets. 237. Throughout the South, state and local politicians protected the of violent acts instead of protecting black Southerners from extrajudicial violence. 38 Some governors, rather than condemn lynchings, made statements that focused on the accused crime of the lynched black person, suggesting that the lynching was justified, and in other cases, affirmatively supported the lynching. 239 And government officials outside the South did little to stop the campaign of widespread lynching. 40 National leaders, for their part, failed to pass even one of more than 100 anti-lynching bills that were proposed in Congress between 1852 and 1951. 141. Public was also complicit. Studies show that thousands of white people, at all levels of class and educational status, participated directly in lynch mobs. Many more participated as spectators, and millions did nothing. 142 participants, meanwhile, were protected by a code of silence. 143 because witnesses refused to cooperate with law enforcement, criminal investigations were thwarted, and the perpetrators of lynchings were able to avoid accountability. 144 of lynching over time. Despite numerous efforts, it is impossible to know how many black people were killed by lynching. Late 19th century, Ida B. started the Red Record efforts to identify incidents of extreme racial violence for research, advocacy, and public policy purposes. 145 other researchers and activists have followed Wells' lead, but there is disagreement on figures among those who study racial terror. Researchers use different criteria of what the lynching, and perpetrators hide their crimes, to list just two reasons that there is no definitive number. Black lynching victims, 246 by any measure. However, lynching occurred in every region of the United States, with victims of all races and genders. 47 And despite disagreement over exact numbers, there is a consensus that between the Civil War and World War II, thousands of African Americans were lynched in the United States and were the primary targets of lynch mobs. 48 The nonprofit organization Equal Justice Initiative, for example, counts nearly 6,500 lynchings nationwide between 1865 and 1950. 49 Any count of lynchings, however, will fall short of the true number, as a result of inadequate reporting at the time, lack of documentation, cover-ups by perpetrators and local officials, and other gaps in the evidence. 50 1990s, when the frequency of lynchings peaked, an average of 104 black people were estimated to have been killed each year by lynch mobs. 51 Then, as black Southerners moved north and west, lynching rates steadily declined during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and lynchings eventually became extraordinary events. 152 Thus, when 15-year-old Emmett Till was lynched in 1954 for allegedly whistling at a white woman, 253 And when a white mob abducted Mac Charles Parker from his jail cell and lynched him in 1959, 254 The killings provoked national public outrage. 155 However, the decline in lynchings did not correspond with an end to the racial caste system that led to lynchings in the first place. 256 Rather, the decline can be attributed to strict segregation laws, tactics of disenfranchisement, and the surge of the death penalty. 157 Beginning in the early 1900s, white Southerners began to fear that the barbaric imagery of lynching would harm the Southern economy. 158 The death penalty offered a more respectable form of violence and the appearance of the rule of law. 259 As early as the 1930s, lynchings were often avoided when government actors made clear that the accused would receive a swift judicial conviction. Justice Initiative estimates 6,500 lynchings nationwide between 1865 and 1950, although any count is an underestimate because of gaps in the evidence like inadequate reporting at the time, lack of documentation, and cover-ups. There is no conclusive evidence proving that the death penalty replaced lynching in the South. Data shows that executions increased as lynchings declined. Southerners themselves referred to these executions as legal lynchings, and Southern leaders argued that African Americans could be intimidated and controlled just as effectively with the death penalty. 105. Racial terror and execution. 260 While there is no conclusive evidence proving that the death penalty replaced lynching in the South, data shows that executions increased as lynchings declined. 161 Indeed, Southerners themselves referred to these executions as legal lynchings, and Southern leaders argued that African Americans could be intimidated and controlled just as effectively with the death penalty. 262 And legal lynchings, like actual lynchings, disproportionately victimized African Americans. 63 From the 1890s to the 1950s, between 53 and 81% of lynchings and executions were of African Americans, although African Americans represented approximately only 10% of the entire U.S. population. 264. 1915, court-ordered executions outpaced lynchings in the former states for the first time, and by the 1930s, 2/3 of those executed were black, a trend that would continue. 165 while black people were executed for allegedly killing white people, the reverse was not true. Lynchings declined from 1930 to 1970. There was a sharp increase in the number of African Americans who were executed for rape, but there is no evidence that a white person was executed for raping a black woman. 66 According to one study, out of more than 11,000 executions in the United States, only 2 white men were executed for killing a black person. 167 Another study of approximately 15,000 executions, from colonial times to the 1990s, found that white people were executed for killing black people in only 29 cases, and in most of those cases, the defendants had also killed white people. 68 These trends in executions reinforce a central of lynching, that the lives of black people were worth less than those of white people. 169 As lynching involves group action against a person as a response to that person's alleged wrongdoing, mob violence involves assaults by civilians of one ethnic group on members of another ethnic group on their ethnicity. 270 These tactics were often used together against the black community. 71 Lynchings were sometimes followed by mob violence, with white mobs burning black homes, devastating black neighborhoods, and forcing black residents to relocate. 72 Mob violence was motivated by the same objectives as lynchings, including extinguishing African Americans' political influence and economic gains, and maintaining social control over African Americans. 273 Racial hierarchy benefited from mob violence. Mob violence was a ritual that built a sense of community among white people and helped the South to sustain a cohesive culture of white supremacy and enforce legal segregation. 74 As discussed above, mass participation was a typical element of lynchings, which drew upwards of thousands of spectators. 75 But mass violence was not strictly a Southern phenomenon. Violence occurred in several northern states prior to 1865, including New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. 176 These northern white mobs, which numbered in the hundreds or thousands, attacked and killed black people and set fire to black properties. 77 The violence was often accompanied by inaction or inadequate response by law enforcement. 278 Virtually none of the perpetrators were prosecuted or convicted. Those that were, received extremely lenient punishments. 179 Americans felt African Americans threatened their superiority. Mob violence sometimes escalated into massacres, destroying cohesive black communities and the prosperity that they built. 80 Historically, these attacks have often been called riots or race riots, but these terms obscure the nature of this violence. Reconstruction, segregation, and the civil rights era, so-called riots were actually massacres. Card depicting the lynching of Leah Daniels, Center, TX. A mob of over 1,000 men stormed the county jail and took the young man who was both charged with and confessed to the murder of a local farmer's wife. 920 of approximately 15,000 executions, from colonial times to the 1990s, found that white people were executed for killing black people in only 29 cases, and in most of those cases, the defendants had also killed white people. 106. Chapter 3 Racial Terror. These attacks, white mobs proactively killed African Americans and destroyed black property, though the black victims were often blamed for inciting the violence in the immediate aftermath. 81 This pattern of violence has evolved and continued through the 20th and 21st centuries, as is discussed in greater detail in Chapter 11 An Unjust Legal System. Inflicted tremendous damage upon black lives and property. 282 It is estimated that over 100 such massacres occurred between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s. 283 Among several notable examples, 284 The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is especially prominent. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921, a black man was arrested for allegedly assaulting a white woman. 85 In response, a white mob looted, burned homes and businesses, and murdered at least 300 black people in Greenwood, a prosperous black neighborhood known as Black Wall Street. 286 Over the course of 24 hours on May 31st and June 1st, the mob destroyed 35 square blocks, more than 1,200 black-owned homes, over 60 businesses, a hospital, a public library, and a dozen black churches. 87,000 of black Tulsans were left homeless and placed in internment camps. 188 Lawyer and reparations advocate Eric J. has testified that, in addition to death and destruction, the massacre inflicted catastrophic mental and emotional trauma upon the black survivors and their descendants. 89 The destruction remained over generations as the city, state, and Chamber of Commerce worked to prevent rebuilding and turned away funding that could have benefited Greenwood. 290 Tulsa Race Massacre Commission confirmed that Tulsa officials not only did nothing to prevent the massacre, but also participated in the violence and provided firearms and ammunition to the mob. 191 Indeed, the city and county police deputized hundreds of white people to participate in the massacre, and the Oklahoma National Guard joined the massacre as well. 92 The commission's report confirmed that no one prosecuted or punished any of the perpetrators for the violent acts that occurred, despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt. 193 Instead, the all-white grand jury falsely blamed black people for the massacre. 294 As stated in the grand jury report, there was no mob spirit among the whites, no talk of lynching, and no. The assembly was quiet until the arrival of the armed Negroes, which precipitated and was the direct cause of the entire affair. 295. Example also highlights the role of the government, at all levels, in mob violence, just as government had once enforced the legal regime of slavery. The other way, declining to prosecute mob members, or by actively fomenting and assisting mob violence, government officials enabled violent white mobs to devastate black communities. Modern lynchings often included torture of the victim before death, in addition to burning, mutilation, and decapitation after death. 296 The torture preceding public killings usually lasted hours, and could involve shoving a hot poker iron down the victim's throat and pressing it against their body, gouging out eyes, castration, cutting off hands and feet, tearing into the flesh with a large corkscrew. The victim alive. 297 As historian Leon F. Litwack explains, the story of a lynching. Story of slow, methodical, sadistic, often highly inventive forms of torture and mutilation. 198 was thus another method with which white people sought to punish black people for stepping beyond their relegated social roles. 199 Victims were often tortured even if they were not convicted of any crime, such shows destroyed houses and billowing smoke during the Tulsa Race Massacre, when a white mob attacked the predominantly African American Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. Universal History Archive, Universal Images Group via Getty Images. 107. Chapter 3 Racial Terror. Two brothers in Paris, Texas were tortured for trying to escape abusive work conditions. 300. As lynching became less common, so too did the accompanying torture. As lynching was replaced with the legal lynching of state executions, the police used torture to extract confessions from black suspects. 101 The police objective was to quickly convict the suspects. 102 Thus, even facing the death penalty, black suspects were frequently denied a fair and impartial trial. 103. Example, in 1938, Dave Canty, a black man, was arrested for killing a white woman and wounding another in the course of a robbery in Montgomery, Alabama. 104 After hours of police questioning, Canty signed a written confession, admitting responsibility for the attack. 305 At trial, however, Canty testified from the witness stand that the police had forced him to confess by torturing him. 306 He gave detailed information about the torture and his torturers, and he showed his wounds and scars to the jury. 307 Police officers and prison staff, however, denied Canty's account of his torture, and at the conclusion of his 3-day trial, Canty was sentenced to death. 8 After a new trial reduced his sentence to life in prison, Canty died in the same prison in which he claimed to have been tortured. 309. Lynching. This form of torture was not public. 310 In fact, hiding it was critical to supporting a racist system. 11 It was difficult for victims and advocates to realize the prevalence of torture, and denials and secrecy made it more difficult to fight the practice. 112 When torture was reported and individuals tried to bring charges, allegations and evidence were ignored and invalidated by white judges, prosecutors, and other officials. 113 While this practice occurred throughout the country, it was especially prevalent in large cities like Chicago and New York City, as well as the American South. 314 There were very rarely any consequences for violence used by in coercing confessions. 315 Police officers often denied the use of such violence, while claiming that regulating police work would lead to an increase in crime. 316 Thus, the decline of lynching and public torture was not a sign of enlightenment. 117 Rather, lynching and torture developed into more modern forms of racial violence, namely, swift executions and coerced confessions. 318 Evidence suggests that police continue to coerce confessions from suspects, including black suspects, leading to wrongful convictions and years of undeserved jail time. 119 From the early 1970s to the early 1990s, for example, then Chicago Police Commander John Berg led officers in torturing over 125 suspects into confessing to crimes, most of whom were African American, and many of whom have said their confessions were false. 120 Berg was convicted for lying under oath about the torture. 121 Killings and vigilantism. Sanctioned violence against African Americans continues today in the form of extrajudicial violence by police officers and vigilantes. This violence is a modern form of lynching throughout American history, including the present day. The police have held the power to strip black people of their rights and lives for any reason, or for no reason at all. Violence is a leading cause of death. Patrols. Police violence during Jim Crow was intended to intimidate black communities and subordinate African Americans within the segregated social order. It was a scene during a riot between Irish American and African American railroad workers employed by the Easton and Amboy Railroad to build the Musconetking Tunnel, in which Dennis Powell, an African American man, is beaten to death by a mob of white men during the Pattonburg Massacre. New Jersey, 1872. Of Theodore R. Davis, Bettmann via Getty Images. 8. Chapter 3 Racial Terror. Black people in America. 322 Today's extrajudicial killings have historical roots in the social control of slave patrols. 323 The lynchings of the late 1800s and early 1900s, and police violence against black Southerners during legal segregation. 324 Slave patrols, which began in the early 1700s, were made up of white volunteers. 325 patrollers were empowered to forcibly discipline enslaved persons, crush potential uprisings, and return enslaved persons who had escaped to their enslavers. 126 Like slave patrols, police violence during Jim Crow was intended to intimidate black communities and subordinate African Americans within the segregated social order. 27. End of the Civil War. Through the early 20th century, racialized policing was often tailored to local concerns. 128 In urban areas, in response to growing economic competition between white workers and black workers moving to cities, the police targeted black residents with curfews, high incarceration rates, and violence, often deadly violence. 29 In rural areas, sheriffs and deputy sheriffs enjoyed essentially unchecked power from their constituents. 330 As a result, the police violently enforced the racist social order against black citizens, even for seemingly minor transgressions. 331 Recognized by the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, contemporary police killings and the trauma that they create are reminiscent of the past racial terror of lynching. 32 Recent incidents of police violence demonstrate this connection. Broadcasting Company has collected a list of recent high-profile killings of African Americans by police, 333 highlighting just a fraction of the more than 1,500 African Americans killed by police since 2015. 134 in 2016, after a Minneapolis police officer killed Philando Castile during a traffic stop. 335 Castile's sister said, "It's just like we're animals." Modern day lynching that we're seeing going on, except we're not getting hung by a tree anymore, we're getting killed on camera. 136 Similarly, in 2020, George Floyd was stopped for allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill, which could have been handled with a ticket. 137 Instead, Floyd was killed by an officer kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. 338 Historian Erika Coleman described Floyd's death as a modern-day lynching.